Welcome back, everyone. Today we're talking about the top 69 red and white cards from 2021. Or the bottom 69 if you prefer.
68, which is you do me and I'll owe you one.
Anyway, there were a lot of cards printed this year, and there are a lot of cards in this list, so I won't be able to spend a ton of time on each one, and I'm sure I've missed a couple cool ones because there were almost 2,000 new cards released this year, which is an insane amount and the most of any year by far. So with that, let's get going. First up is BOROS Commanders, and what's notable here is that there are about 45 BOROS Commanders right now, and 15 of them were printed this year. 1/3 of all the BOROS Commanders that exist were printed this year, and there are a lot of very interesting ones. We see a lot of them on this page right here. Just a lot of new and unique effects that BOROS hasn't really had before. It definitely picked up this year, so any of these commanders are a lot of fun to play and give you some interesting decks that you can make with them. We see a bunch more commanders here. Brunor and General Ferris Rokirik are probably two of my favorites from this year. Brunor is insane in equipment decks, and General Ferris Rokirik has a really interesting card pool and allows you to use a bunch of older cards that have been kicking around the format for a while that are starting to get outclassed in a lot of places, but actually gives you a lot of incentive to play them, so I do like what that deck brings. Cole can be very powerful. You can build like near CEDH levels of Cole if you want. Zabaz is very interesting. It's kind of a tricky commander to play because there's only a handful of like other good modular cards. And the three in the middle I have not played yet, but I've seen Sean pilot Quintorius quite a bit, and it's interesting. It doesn't exactly blow you away with power, but there's some cool things you can do with that deck. And then finally, my least favorite BOROS commanders from this year. Odric Bloodcursed is a mess mechanically. The card is just not designed well at all. Played a couple games with it, didn't have a particularly great time trying to make it work. Velomachus' main problem is really its mana cost. If it was 6 mana, I think it would be much more palatable. It's also just kind of a difficult deck to build. It's going to be a little bit of trial and error getting the Velomachus deck right, and the one thing that I don't care for that much is like, the best way to build Velomachus is probably just with Armageddons, and you know, it's not really what I'm after. But yeah, I just found Velomachus to be a little expensive and a little difficult to kind of get right. And then finally, Rem Carlos, I was a little disappointed in. It has a cool ability, but I felt as a commander, it's just very slow. It does not close the game out very quickly, and I know my builds probably could have been a little tighter, but still, I just feel like the ability's cool, but it doesn't give you a great way to close out the game, so you're really looking to the other cards in your deck to do that. Moving on from that, we've got Mono Red Commanders. Here are my top picks for Mono Red Commanders from this year, with Rionia being far and away the most powerful and probably one of the most interesting on this list. It just does everything. Maybe in a year or two we're sick of Rionia because it is very, very strong. Like that time I had 15 lands on turn 5. She can be a very consistent turn 4, 5, or 6 deck. Magda, powerful and interesting. Terralf, very powerful. Delina is very interesting, can go in a lot of decks. So yeah, you can't go wrong building any of these. These are all really great picks from this year. And here's a bunch of the other red commanders that came out this year also. Notably, Ragavan is probably the most powerful 1-drop ever printed. It is insane. I don't know what it's like in the command zone. I assume because it's the most powerful 1-drop ever printed, it's probably still insane in the command zone, but I haven't actually tried it yet. The rest of the ones, Burgi is also kind of up in that CEDH level if you want it to be. You can build a pretty nasty storm deck with it if you want to. The other ones on here I haven't really tried. They're maybe a little bit less exciting than some of the other options, but, you know, if you want to build them, go right ahead. Which brings us to Mono White Commanders. So here's my top picks for Mono White Commanders this year. Adeline being my favorite because it does have a lot of power. Like, Nadar and Mavinda are very cool and very dirtily, but they don't inherently have like tons and tons of power. Adeline has tons and tons of power, as does Helvar, and as does Icing Death. Icing Death can kill you surprisingly quickly. Just as like a really standard mono white Voltron, Halvar the same thing. If you get any sort of X and Y, plus an Inquisitor's Flail with Halvar, is lethal on a player if they don't block. That's how much damage we're talking about with Halvar. Adeline, the damage scales really well. Skull Clamp is insane. There's a lot of cool card choices you get to make with Adeline because of the 1/1s that come in. Really enjoying that deck. I've got it built in paper. I previously had that deck as a Halvar deck, and I've also got a Mavinda deck built in paper right now. So just to give you guys an idea of, yeah, these are the ones that I really like from this year that really do some cool stuff. And then we see the rest of the mono white commanders. Oswald is definitely interesting, but having not played the deck myself, I haven't gone through all the lines of every little thing you can do with it yet, but it is a very interesting commander. Redain is probably not my favorite as a commander, but I love Redain in the 99 of a deck, especially equipment decks. She just does so much. There's a lot of wording on her, and sometimes if you're facing red decks or decks with like random shots of 1 damage, Valkmira on the backside is also really powerful. The others I haven't really played on this page, but I'm sure they do have a home somewhere. Lochiel in particular is good with all the artifact commanders we saw earlier, like Alabu and Osgir, and in fact he came in the same deck. Next, we're going to get into some deck-specific cards that came out this year that really pushed some decks, starting with Feather.
Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Light as a feather, stiff as a board. Light as a feather, stiff as a board.
Feather became insane this year, and I was actually caught off guard a little bit because I did some video a while back. I think it was the What Do You Hate Losing To video, and someone in the comments wrote Feather, and I kind of scratched my head a little bit. I'm like, Feather's good, but Feather isn't, like, insane. And then I updated Feather with all of these, and no, it's insane now. It's a crazy deck. Like, it is a very easy turn 6 deck if you get any of these in play. You just have so much value and just run away with the game if you want to. Goldspan Dragon being insanely good, but it has a very high price tag, and I don't envision that price tag coming down at any point. The other ones are much cheaper, with Stormkiln and Burgi, and they also do a very, very good job in that deck. Cards that I need to pick up since I've recently rebuilt my Feather deck as well. And Angel Fire Ignition I have not used with Feather yet, but it does look very good, and it is one that I want to try. If you're thinking about any sort of combat damage with Feather, or if the size of Feather matters, I like Fall of the Hammer a lot, then Angel Fire Ignition I think is going to be pretty solid, and one that I'm very excited to try out. Next up, the Angels deck. Similar to Feather, my Angels deck went from good to insane this year, and a good chunk of that had to do with new cards that were printed. Starnheim Aspirant, I love. Basically a white-shifted version of the one that does the same thing for dragons. And I love that type of card where it's great for one deck. It's not a card you just jam in every single deck, but it's really good for the decks that want it. Search for Glory is a massive pickup for white. Search for Glory is probably one of the most needed cards in white this year, and I can't say enough about what it does. I use it a lot. It is a fantastic card. In the middle, we've got Sarah's Emissary, which a lot of people have underrated, I think. I actually saw some comments on Twitter that it wasn't very good, and I'm like, what are you talking about? You and creatures you control have protection from the chosen card type, usually creatures, meaning you can't be attacked, they can't block you, and any abilities that target from creatures, you don't care about. You basically don't care about creatures anymore, or whatever card type you choose. Occasionally, depending on what you're facing, you might need to choose some other card types, but yeah, Sarah's Emissary is insane when it sticks. Angel of the Runes, really good in Angel decks, really good in Reanimator decks. Exile 2 artifacts and or enchantments is really powerful. A lot of gods came out over the past 4 or 5 years, so having Exile on a creature is very, very good. On an ETB nonetheless, which also got some support this year. And then Enduring Angel, also really good. Haven't played with it a ton, but I have cheated death with it once or twice now, and it is a lot of fun. It's very powerful, and even just on the front side, flying in Double Strike means it carries equipment really well. So a lot of things to like about Enduring Angel. And finally, Pyre of Heroes. Oh my god. Pyre of Heroes is insane for the Angels deck. It's also insane for just any tribal deck that didn't have access to green or something like that. Pyre of Heroes is amazing, because now you can go fish the thing out of your deck that you're really trying to get. In my case, it's usually a Maria Shepherd, because there is not a great way to search for that card other than Pyre of Heroes. So yeah, love these cards. Angels deck got a huge pickup this year and is like several turns quicker than it used to be, and really has a lot more like resilience. The 3 angels on this page have a really particular set of skills.
But what I do have are a very particular set of skills
That just give you tons and tons of utility. Moving on from that, next up is equipment decks. So we talked about Brunor a little bit, we talked about Halvar a little bit, both insane equipment commanders, but then of course there's the other equipment cards that were printed this year. Maybe not tons and tons of cards, but the ones on this page are highly impactful. Starnheim Cursor, probably the weakest of the bunch, but still really nice, really playable in an equipment deck. Fighter Class is insane. I've been replacing Open the Armory with Fighter Class because level 2 on Fighter Class is unbelievable. The one thing equipment decks have been missing for years and years was free equips. Free equips take equipment decks from good to insane, and it's very easy to get to level 2 on Fighter Class, so unbelievably good equipment tutor. If you're running an equipment deck, you should probably be running Fighter Class. Sword of Hearthenholm is one of the craziest cards ever printed. It combos with just about everything, any ETB creature, it gets your commander back, it ramps you, it does so much. It does literal everything. It is one of the best equipment ever printed. And then, not to be outdone, Cauldron Complete is also really strong. Its mana cost makes it a little bit harder to use in a lot of decks. Chances are you are going to want some amount of free equips in there, like if you are playing something like a Brunor or a Halvar, that's going to help a lot. But the 7 mana does make it a little bit tricky, but when you do get it in, you now have a threat in play that is really hard to deal with and makes any creature you put it on super threatening. Great for closing the game out and also great for surviving through a lot of removal. And it's worth pointing out that, like, these cards came after last year, in which there was also a ton of equipment support printed, so equipment has got a lot of love over the past 2 years, and you can build some really strong equipment decks now. Moving on from that, we got something that has been needed so incredibly badly, that is card draw in mono white. So here we see some of the best card draw options from this year, with Showdown of the Scalds being the one BOROS card on this page, but I do really like Showdown of the Scalds. It gives you a couple extra cards, which is great, but also that +1/+1 counter mode is helpful for decks that want to be attacking. Either Voltron decks or even in like Ferris Rokirik, I've used it to just pump up some of my creatures and allow them to attack more freely without getting killed by blockers. Showdown of the Scalds, really great card. It doesn't just win you the game, but it does a lot of nice things. Priest of Ancient Lore, Welcoming Vampire, both very solid, can definitely go in a lot of decks. Esper Sentinel, I've been putting in a lot of decks. I like Esper Sentinel, but it is a tricky card. If you don't pump it up at all, opponents do have a tendency to play around it, especially if they have a lot of extra mana. So it becomes really important to put an equipment on it, get some +1/+1 counters on it, or just pump it up one way or another. Once you get it to about 2 or 3, then opponents probably aren't going to pay for it, and then you're going to be drawing cards. But as a 1-drop, you can't ask for much more than that. It is very powerful, it's been very good. And then finally, Eye of Vecna. I really like Eye of Vecna for mono white and mono red, and it is actual card draw, not impulse draw. As good as impulse draw is, it does get awkward sometimes. There was a game very recently where I had a really bad turn 4 Ignite the Future. You know what, let's just Ignite the Future. See if we can get to that white mana right here. We haven't made a land drop yet, so we can play a land off here, which is nice. Don't be our big stuff. It's our big stuff. Wow. Wow, that really hurts. I had no white mana and 3 white cards like Teferi's Protection, Doomscar, and something else cool that we definitely wanted, and lost to the impulse draw. So, Eye of Vecna, true card draw, really good. I like that one a lot. All of these cards are fantastic. And here we see some other card draw options that came out this year. Secret Rendezvous, you're only going to run it if you really have to. I would say try to avoid it if you can, but if you do need card draw, you don't have access to like Skull Clamp or something like that, any of the more expensive options, it's a card that exists. From the little bit of it that I've seen, there is a cost to giving your opponents 3 cards. The one game I remember offhand, I let one of my opponents draw 3 cards, and then they attacked me for about 45 on their next turn. I think I had a Fog or a Teferi's Protection or something like that and got out of it, but, you know, the cost is very real of giving your opponents 3 cards. Sigarda Splendor, haven't had a chance to use much yet, but it does look very interesting. And same thing with Wedding Ring. Wedding Ring not available on Magic Online, so I haven't actually played it yet, but it does look pretty solid. I'm curious to see it in action, but I think it is a very reasonable card. Next up, we got some really good board wipes this year. 3 fantastic board wipes in Doomscar, Out of Time, and Vanquish the Horde. So one of the things that I was noticing like late last year was that when you wipe the board, let's say you cast a Fumigate or an Austere Command, sorcery speed board wipes, you have probably tapped out most of your turn to do that, and then all of your opponents get to rebuild before you, so even though you've wiped the board, when it comes back to your turn, you're still kind of on the back foot a lot of the time, which is where these cheaper cost-reduced board wipes help a lot, because you can foretell Doomscar, then cast it, and probably still cast another thing on your turn afterwards. Vanquish the Horde, same idea. If it's cheap enough, you can definitely do more stuff after the Vanquish the Horde. And Out of Time I haven't used yet, but people have told me it's really good. Notably, it phases things out, so if you have commanders that you want to get off the battlefield and you don't want to see them again, at least for a little while, Out of Time is a reasonable option, and people tell me it's pretty good, so it's one that I'm looking to check out, and one worth taking note of. Moving on from that, we also got some fantastic protection spells this year. Every card on this page is fantastic. The only one I don't care for that much is Lorehold Command, just because it's a little bit too expensive, but the modes on it are very good. But the rest of these, all top notch, and you can put in any white deck, and they will probably make that deck better. With probably Guardian of Faith being my personal favorite. Because it's a creature, you can just do a lot with it. ETBs matter, reanimation matters. It's just good. But then, of course, there's Cosmic Intervention, and Cosmic Intervention is also fantastic. If you're running Foretell cards, I recommend running at least 2 of them, just so your opponents don't figure out it's always Doomscar, right? If you put a little bit of doubt in their head, then they're not going to be sure if it's the protection spell or the board wipe or whatever you're doing. But the other thing, too, is that I learned this trick recently. If you cast Cosmic Intervention and then crack a fetch, that fetch will come back at your end step, and then you crack it again at your end step, and then it'll come back again at the following end step, meaning you've just gotten 3 lands off a single fetch land in the turn that you cast Cosmic Intervention. That is a really cool interaction, and one that can get you very far ahead, and one that I'm thinking about. I'm like, I need to be running a little more Cosmic Intervention. That card is good. Blacksmith Skill, fantastic piece of protection. Just run it in your white decks. It's unbelievable. At some point in a game, someone's going to try to blow up one of your things. And then finally, Glorious Protector in Semester's End, good for ETB decks, maybe a little more narrow than the other ones, but still fantastic and still very good cards. Moving on from that, we also got some really good recursion this year. I'll start with Resurgent Belief. Resurgent Belief is fantastic for enchantment decks, because most people don't want to pay the price tag for Replenish, and I don't blame them. Resurgent Belief is fantastic for those style of decks, and I've definitely lost to my share of Resurgent Beliefs this year. Wake the Past is one that I haven't got to play yet, but it's great for the artifact decks. There are about 4 or 5 of these type cards now that mass reanimate artifacts, and if Wake the Past ever gets printed online, that's something I want to tinker with. I could just dump all of my cards into the graveyard and then try to pull them all out at once with Wake the Past, Triumphant Reckoning, there's one out of Dark Steel, I think, and Open the Vaults type stuff. So you're starting to get a critical mass of that type of card for these mass artifact reanimates that could be really cool. In the middle, we've got Ardent Elementalist and Return Passcaller. Notably, these are an easy way to get spells back in red or red-white, which has been a struggle. That hasn't been a thing that those colors have had a lot of access to, so these are nice pickups. They don't go in every deck, but they are very playable in the right deck. And then we've got Reconstruct History. Reconstruct History is a fantastic card. Again, brings back spells, which is a thing that's been generally tough for red-white. It's a little disappointing that it doesn't bring back a creature. Like, it'd probably be insane if it brought back a creature, but it's still really good and still does a lot. It's a little awkward early, but in the late game, it is a great card to pick up. And then there's Venerable Warsinger, one that I've been trying to include. I haven't been playing as much Go Wide Aggro, but when I do play Go Wide Aggro, Venerable Warsinger, a very solid choice. Particularly if you can put like an equipment on it or something also. Next up, we see some spot removal that came out this year. Tibolt's Trickery is a very notable one, tore up Modern for a little while. And it also just leads to really good stories, because people don't expect the mono-red counterspell. Had a fun moment in a game the other night where we were playing a 5-player game of Sheriff, and I figured out who my teammate was, and they were sending a lethal attack over to the player that I needed them to lethal attack. One of the middle players tried to fire an Anguished Unmaking at their creature, and I'm like, you can try! Dropped the Tibolt's Trickery, and everyone was like, whoa! It was fun. It was a cool moment. So Tibolt's Trickery leads to that sort of stuff, but every once in a while, I've had it backfire a few times. Either they find a board wipe or they find an Ugin, and that's not great. So there is definitely a cost, but there's a lot of upside to it as well. Rip Apart, fantastic piece of spot removal. Generally better for your lower to the ground type settings. If everyone's trying to like end the game around turn 5, turn 6, Rip Apart's going to be good for that type of setting. Don't necessarily need it for games that are going to go longer, a little bit slower. Solitude is fantastic. What's unfortunate is its price tag. It is very expensive, but if you can afford it, white ETB decks, just decks in general, it's just a really good card. Same sort of thing with Fury. Maybe a little bit less good than Solitude because it is only 4 damage, and Fury also has a bit of a price tag on it when you can just get Flame Tongue Kavu for like 50 cents. The Double Strike is nice, but I'm not running out of my way to get a Fury, but it is a solid choice nonetheless. And then finally, Meteor Swarm is one that I've just recently gotten to play. It's solid. Don't think of it as a board wipe. Think of it as a piece of spot removal that's probably going to kill like 2 or 3 creatures, and it's very solid for doing that. Because it's not a board wipe, you're going to keep your commander in play, and you're going to gain that tempo while that happens. Now your opponents have to rebuild, and you're free to kind of keep doing your thing. So Meteor Swarm, nice little card. Moving on from that, we've got some ramp. Loyal Warhound, really big pickup for white. So now you're starting to get a critical mass of these type of creatures that put planes into play. So when you're doing mono white ETB, this is definitely one that I'm going to look at. Probably the best card on this page is Archaeomancer's Map. Archaeomancer's Map is fantastic. The prices come down on them a little bit. I think they're about 8 last I looked. I would pick a couple of these up. This is essentially mono white Cultivate with a little bit of Burgeoning mixed in. It is a very powerful card, and if it stays in play for a couple turns, especially if there's a green deck at the table, you're going to get a lot of value from it and just be leading the table on mana very easily. We've also got Monologue Tax, which is another interesting one. Think of it as budget Smothering Tithe. Not nearly as broken as Smothering Tithe, and it's a little awkward in the early game. As you get to the mid game and later game, people will start casting multiple spells a turn, start getting that extra mana. And it is nice for that. It's very playable. It's not the first thing that I'm going for in a lot of decks. I still like Thran Dynamo better. There's even a lot of times where I might go like Skyclave Relic instead, but it's a solid choice on its budget. Cursed Mirror, only used it a couple times, but it is fantastic. A lot of utility, just a really nice card to have. Unfortunately, a little bit expensive for what it does, I feel, money-wise. And finally, one that I need to use a little bit more is Moonsilver Key. Allows you to search for an artifact with a mana ability. May I submit to you that Feast and Famine is a mana ability because it will produce more mana than any other card you search for with Moonsilver Key. I know that's not how the rules work, but they really should. Moving on from that, we got some classes this year. The class cards are really interesting. They're really fun. I like them a lot. Fighter class is insane for equipment decks. I find with Cleric class and Paladin class that they aren't typically best in slot for a lot of decks, or at least a lot of the decks that I play. I've been kind of on the mono white ETB thing this year. I guess if I built a life gain deck, Cleric class would be pretty cool. But they're just good to have around. So if you're trying to build like everything super tight and best in slot possible, you may not have room for these, but if you have a slightly more lax environment, game's going to go 7, 8, 9 turns, you can definitely put one of these in, and they're just nice to have around. And then finally, there's Barbarian class. A little disappointed in Barbarian class just because the first 2 modes care about dice rolling, and that's just a very low number of decks that exist in the format. So it's good for those decks, but you're not going to run this just for the haste. Fervor and Hammer of Perforos, much better haste enablers without jumping through as many hoops. Next up, we've got some random mono white creatures. Dawnbreaker Cleric is a surprisingly good pickup. The modes on it are fantastic, great for ETB decks. After that, we've got Strict Proctor, gives you a really interesting ability. Countering your own detrimental ETBs can be really cool. Stuff like Dowsing Dagger, Lotus Field, even like a Bounce Land or something like that. All really good stuff. In addition to being annoying for your opponents, so all really good stuff. Intrepid Adversary, I haven't had a chance to use, but I did chat with Rachel Weeks at Magic Fest Vegas, and she said it was awesome in her Winota deck because it's not a cast, so when it comes in, you can pump the mana into it and just make your team huge. And then finally, I got to look at Savior of Olenbach recently. Ryan played it in a paper game we were playing, and it was insane. Especially combined with like an Eternal Witness because they can just keep getting each other back. It is ridiculous. It is a very good card and one that I think is a bit undervalued right now. I get it. Most people are feeling the burnout from the 2,000 or so new cards that were printed this year, and this one came out late in the year. It's just easy to miss, but I would definitely check this one out. After that, we see some cool red creatures that came out this year. Unfortunately, it's not on Magic Online, but Vengeful Ancestor, the 1 or 2 times that I've seen it, is really powerful. Goading your opponent's stuff is a nasty thing to do. They lose agency over their creatures, and now they have to attack your other opponents. This is everything you want. Am I going to run this in every deck? No, probably not. But especially if I have some way to reuse an ETB, maybe like a Sword of Hearthenholm, or a devoted ETB deck, it's going to be really good. Battlecry Goblin, fantastic for Goblin decks. You could probably also run it in Winota. I could see it being reasonable there since that deck does run a lot of Goblins anyway. But solid card overall. Good for Goblins, good for tokens. Zorn helps with the treasure creation if you're trying to do some sort of red treasure-based thing. And Maniform Hellkite, I haven't had a chance to use, but it does look very, very good. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create an XX dragon with flying and haste, and then you exile it at the end of the turn. Just It's a lot of free value right there, is what that is. Reminds me a little bit of Monastery Mentor, which is an insane magic card. And then here's a couple of random cards that didn't fit into any of the other categories. Teleportation Circle, fantastic for ETB decks. White got a lot of ETB love this year, and that's probably a category that I should have put in this video. But Teleportation Circle, essentially a second copy of Conjurer's Closet, a little more durable and a little cheaper as an enchantment. Very, very nice. Blade Historian, really, really good. You can put Blade Historian into just about any Boros deck, and it's probably going to make it better. Double Strike is a powerful ability, and giving it to all of your attacking creatures is absolutely amazing. It's one of those things that when it comes down, you're like, oh crap, we're about to die. And then finally, Crackle with Power is an interesting one. I've tried using it as an alternate win condition in some of my aggro decks. I do find that you need a critical mass of mana to really have a lot of success with it, but once you start getting north of like 10 to 12 mana, it does become very, very powerful and gets to a point where it just kills everyone at the table. And it's not like Torment of Hailfire where you can kind of play around it by either having a lot of tokens or having a lot of life. At some point, if they have like 30 mana to go into a Crackle with Power, you're just going to die and there's nothing you can do about it. Which doesn't make for the best gameplay necessarily, but it is effective if that's what you're looking for. Any sort of big mana deck is going to like Crackle with Power a lot. And then finally, we see some cool lands that came out this year. Alpine Meadow is notable in that it is a third searchable red-white dual land. So if you don't have access to Plateau because they're very expensive, but you do have some fetches, Alpine Meadow is a nice second option to get. Urza's Saga is fantastic, but it is very expensive, which is unfortunate. Axguard Armory is nice. I find that I don't always activate it in a game, but if a game does start to go long, that ability is really nice to get. And you may want to think about adding an aura card into your deck, because I typically run it for equipment. But I've thought about dropping a single aura in there just to have that value when it comes up. What's that cool one? Is it Timeless Ward? Is that the name of it? That you can flash it and protect your commander. That type of thing. Lorehold Campus and Needleverge Pathway aren't the first cards that I'm going for, but if you have a budget mana base, they're very reasonable, very playable. But if you have fetches and shocks and Alpine Meadow and stuff like that, I do try to keep my basic land counts really high now because of Hearth and Home, because of Mary Shepherd, because of Sword of the Animus. So I'm probably only going for Lorehold and Needleverge if I don't care about my basic land count and if I don't have fetches and all of that stuff. Witch's Clinic, I've seen Witch's Clinic change some games. Particularly with like a Voltron deck, if the commander gets big, you can gain a lot of life back, and that is a really powerful thing to do. And it's one that I need to start adopting into my decks a little bit more. Sadly, I don't think it's on Magic Online yet. And then finally, Tyrite Sanctum is a very interesting one. You can make a creature a god, and then make a god indestructible. That is powerful protection, and it is also a huge flavor win because you can turn any creature type you want into a legendary god. And it's funny, almost all of the time. So let me know in the comments below, what are some of the best legendary god creatures that you've made with Tyrite Sanctum this past year? Anyone got like legendary god squirrel or anything like that? So anyway, that is my top 69 red and white cards from this year. If you actually go through and count, it's a bit more than 69. But if you remove all the legendaries, it's pretty close. But yeah, a lot of cards came out this year. And I found that like, I basically just couldn't process the other three colors this year. I found that I turned inward this year. And I mean, to be fair, I also had some life stuff going on too. But I did turn inward and played a lot of red-white this year. I would say probably more than I've played in at least the past couple years. I haven't counted, but I feel like I played a lot of it this year and really focused on a lot of the red-white cards that came out this year and not as much on the Sultai color cards that came out this year because there's just too many. Like, you can't keep up on everything. It's absolutely insane. So anyway, what'd you guys think of my list? Is there anything that I missed? Because it is also worth noting that this list is heavily skewed towards deck styles that I like to play. But that does make it easy to miss something. So anyway, let me know what your favorite cards were from this year, and we'll wrap it up there. Be sure to comment, like, and subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching. I want to thank my awesome Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. If you want to help support the channel, vote on which decks I play next, or if you're just looking to get a game of webcam EDH going, be sure to check out my Patreon at the link below.